By the spring of 1945, the Allied push into the heart of Germany had transitioned from a lightning advance to a heavy, sluggish occupation. Whole districts were scorched, supply lines were severed, and the shattered roads were filled with survivors who no longer had a home to return to. Scattered among them were thousands of German women, secretaries, telegraphists, factory girls, nurses, assistants, and civilians caught in the wake of the Wehrmacht's retreat. Now marked as enemy detainees or female prisoners under American jurisdiction, they were marched, trucked, and redistributed incessantly as temporary holding areas overflowed. Many of these women anticipated that surrender would bring interrogation, imprisonment, and fear. What they did not expect was how rapidly their physical strength would be destroyed by manual labor meant for soldiers performed in the freezing rain with nothing to shield their skin. By the time they finally whispered the words, "Our hands are bleeding," the damage was already deep. The first compound was makeshift, little more than a wired-off field near a gutted railway station. The fencing was strung in jagged rows. Sentry posts were nailed together from salvaged cratewood. The soil was a frozen slurry of mud, crushed brick, and soot from the furnaces that had gone cold weeks prior. The women arrived in batches of 30 to 50, guarded by American units moving toward the rear. Some still wore pieces of service dress, gray tunics stripped of their eagles, boots with worn-through soles. Others were in domestic clothes that had been shredded by months of fleeing and bombing raids. There was no formal processing at the start. Names were logged when possible. Birth years were guessed. Skills were recorded, only if a sergeant bothered to ask. Most of the GIs were young men from the Midwest who had never been told they would be overseeing women, let alone thousands of them. Labor details started without delay. The perimeter had to be fortified. Drainage pits had to be shoveled. Tent poles had to be hammered. Rubble from the access roads had to be hauled away so Patton's tanks could move through the slush. None of this toil was out of place for a detention site in 1945. What was out of place was the workforce. The women were handed equipment: spades, mattocks, hammers, rusted shears found in abandoned rail yards. There were no gloves. None were provided. The quartermasters focused on rations, ammo, and gasoline. Hand protection was simply non-existent. At first, the women made no sound. They labored with numb fingers in the sleet, clawing at ice-licked stone that sliced their palms with every movement. Wood shards drove into thumbs. Metal edges bit into wrists. Blisters bubbled, then burst. Blood pooled into rags made from torn aprons and headscarves. By the third day, many could no longer close their fists. By the fifth, some could no longer move their joints. Still, they pushed on, not out of loyalty, but because stopping meant a loss of bread, a night in the open, or being marked as a saboteur. Most had learned by then that invisibility was the only way to survive. The American guards saw the blood gradually. At first, it was just stains. Red smears on the handles of shovels, dark spots on the knees of trousers. One private thought the women were just clumsy. Another figured it was part of the process. Then one morning during the dawn headcount, a girl in the front rank dropped her pickaxe. It hit the frozen mud with a heavy thud. She didn't move to retrieve it. With a heavy thud, her hands were cocooned in cloth that was already soaked through. When she tried to flex her fingers, they shook with a violent tremor. Red droplets fell from the bandages onto the white frost. A sergeant barked for her to pick up her tool. She stood still. Instead, an older woman standing behind her spoke softly at first, then louder so the whole line could hear. "Our hands are bleeding." The statement wasn't a scream. It wasn't a protest. It was a simple, exhausted fact. The sergeant stepped forward. For the first time, he actually saw. Nearly every woman in that formation had their hands bound in filth. Some used woolen socks. Some used strips of lining. Others had nothing at all, revealing raw, split skin and weeping sores aggravated by the biting cold. The labor ceased that hour. Not by a whistle. No command was shouted, but the shovels were never lifted again. The sergeant called for a medic. The medic arrived frustrated, expecting to treat faked illnesses. What he saw instead was a row of women whose hands looked like they had been through a meat grinder rather than a work site. Skin torn to the bone, fingers blue from exposure. He muttered one word that traveled up the ranks. Infected. News reached headquarters faster than a combat report. This wasn't a breach of rules. It wasn't a strike. It was a breakdown of logistics. The laws of war demanded basic care for detainees. These women weren't frontline combatants. Many were just girls. By that evening, General Patton himself had been driven to the site. He didn't offer a speech. They didn't offer an apology. But agony needs no interpreter. That night, the routine was broken. Work continued, but only after changes were made. Gloves were seized from nearby warehouses, even if they weren't the right size. When those ran out, canvas bags were stitched into mittens. Engine oil was applied to cracked skin to seal the wounds. It wasn't an act of mercy. It was a restoration of order. But to the women, it felt like a miracle. It felt like being human again. The infirmary became the heart of the compound. Hands were cleaned in basins of cold water. Disinfectant was used sparingly. Gauze was washed and used again. Some women wept, not because of the stinging alcohol, but because they were allowed to rest while they were tended to. Others were bitter. They asked why it took a general to notice they were bleeding. No one had an answer. The duties were shifted. Heavy excavation was halted. Lighter work, sorting mail, peeling potatoes, repairing uniforms, were given to those whose fingers would never fully recover. But the scars were already set. Some women never regained their sense of touch. Nerve damage from the frost and the filth lasted a lifetime. Knuckles remained swollen. For a few, the rot was too deep, necessitating amputations in the field hospitals. Myths began to circulate. Some said the Americans were testing their breaking point. Others thought it was a deliberate lesson for the crimes of the regime. A few whispered that the Americans were different, that if you showed them the truth, they would fix it. Nobody was certain. The GIs were affected too. Many were just boys, remembering their mothers and sisters back in Kansas or Ohio. Watching women break under their watch left a mark on them. One corporal wrote to his wife that he felt he was presiding over a graveyard of the living. Winter eventually broke. The snow melted. The mud turned to dust. The hands that had started to close split open again with the changing air. The women kept their hands wrapped even in the sun, hiding the scars that told the story of 1,945. Every morning, the check-in showed new skin, and every day the silence remained. By the summer of 1,945, the camp was dissolved. The women were moved to permanent centers with real beds, indoor plumbing, and doctors. Work was voluntary. Meals were consistent. It wasn't freedom, but it was life. One officer, an older man who knew the language, stood before a group and told them the war was over, that they would be going home, that the suffering was finished. Some believed him, some couldn't, but when they looked at their hands, scarred but healed, they realized the world had changed. It wasn't about pity, it was about being recognized. The blood had stopped. The pain remained as a memory. Years later, those who survived didn't talk about the hunger or the fences. They talked about the moment the shovels hit the ground. The day they said it out loud, "Our hands are bleeding," and the world finally looked down. If these moments of history matter to you, and you want these voices to be heard, please consider liking the video and subscribing. Your support keeps these memories alive. Deconstructed elements.